All right, welcome back to AFF. We have one more chapter to cover. One more chapter to cover here, and that's the chapter on immune systems, which really, if we are talking about how this immune system functions, then we're talking about a chapter here on immunology. Basically, what immune systems are about is a concentrated and coordinated response to a particular pathogen. So it's the animal's response to the presence of a pathogen. The pathogen intends to do the host some harm, and the immune system is developed to be able to effectively deal with the pathogen. Right? So it's a system devoted to dealing with disease-causing organisms. Pathogens are disease-causing organisms. Now, all the animals have immune systems, but they don't all have the same type of immune system. So if we look across the animal kingdom, there are basically two different types of approaches to an immune system. All of the animals have this basic approach here, which is an immune system involved in what we refer to as innate immunity. All the animals have this type of an immune system, and as an aside, even plants have innate immunity. With innate immunity, we're talking about responses to pathogens that are not specific. That is, how that innate immune system responds to a pathogen is not affected by whether the organism has seen that particular pathogen before. So up here, what they're calling a summary of non-specific host defenses is basically innate immunity, because we're talking about non-specific responses. It doesn't matter if this immune system has seen the pathogen before. So things that are listed here are things like anatomical barriers, which are structures that have been put in the way of an invading pathogen. So your skin, your integument, functions as an anatomical barrier to prevent the entry in of microbes. We also secrete substances onto the surface of our skin to decrease the pH, to make it more difficult for a lot of organisms to live there. We produce a lot of mucus from mucous membranes. These mucous membranes occur at places where there are openings into our body. So the oral cavity opening into the digestive system has a lot of mucosal membranes. The nasal passages going into the lungs have a lot of mucosal membranes. Your anus and rectum would have these membranes as well. So the idea is that we have a set of normal flora that live in these places, and the presence of them help keep out the bad ones. So we talked a little bit about this in the large intestine, but this same kind of thing is going on in your nose, in your sinuses, in your throat, etc. There's a resident population of bacteria, and that resident population we get along with okay. They're not pathogenic bacteria, and their presence helps to keep out the bad ones, the pathogenic ones, the ones that cause disease. So the normal flora compete for attachment sites, and this mucus also entraps these foreign organisms, and these cells associated with these membranes are often ciliated, and they move the mucus in a particular direction to clear the body of whatever's been trapped in the mucus. So I'm thinking like your lungs with all those ciliated cells, propelling mucus up into that pharynx and then down into the digestive system. Okay? We also have physiological barriers. We can increase our body temperature to inhibit the growth of some bacteria. acidity of the stomach kills a lot of microorganisms, not all of them, but it kills a lot of them. In our saliva, we make this lysozyme stuff that is hydrolytic to peptidoglycan, the major component of bacterial cell walls. We also, in response to infection by a virus, a lot of cells will produce this interferon stuff. Interferon reduces the ability of viruses to further infect cells. Okay, so lots of different approaches here. Inflammatory barriers, phagocytic, endocytic barriers. All of these things are what I would call not specific. They're not built to target any one type of bacteria or virus or parasitic eukaryote, but they're very general effects, right? The barrier is going to stop everybody. Okay? Now, let me show you an example of how this kind of innate immunity kind of plays out. There are particular cells that are particular players in the immune system that are involved in this innate immunity. So on my chart here, the one you can access on Blackboard, I have a red star by a bunch of cells. These red starred cells are cells of the immune system that are also involved in innate immunity. So we're not just talking about physical barriers or physiological barriers. Now we're talking about a cellular component to this innate immunity, and these cells that have stars collectively are involved in this innate immune response. So before we go through to number 2, let's keep going with this innate immunity a little bit and just talk about all these cell types that I have starred. So the ones that have been starred are these that are listed here. So there are a group of cells that fall under the broad category here of leukocytes. And the leukocytes include 6 different types of cells. The first one is called a neutrophil. Right now I have my list here that I can read off of as we go along through these cell types. So neutrophils are phagocytic cells, and they're the most abundant leukocyte in the body. They're also important in mediating the inflammatory response that we'll talk about here in a second. But they're phagocytic cells, meaning they're capable of doing phagocytosis. Okay. Second cell type is an eosinophil. Okay, an eosinophil, these release toxins that are involved in killing cells, and they also participate in phagocytosis. So like the neutrophils, they're phagocytic. Okay, phagocytic here, and they're also involved in the production of toxins to kill cells. Okay. Monocytes. Right. The monocytes are important because they can develop into macrophages. And then the next one in our list is the macrophage. Right? And macrophages, like the neutrophils and eosinophils, are also capable of doing phagocytosis. So you're hopefully starting to sense a pattern here, right, in the innate immune system cellular component. And then basophils. Basophils are secretory cells. They're capable of secreting a lot of different compounds. One of these is this molecule called heparin. And heparin is important because it's an anti-clotter. Okay? They do this at the site of the infection to prevent clots from forming and to allow cells to continue to come in through the circulatory system. Okay? They can also produce histamine. We talked about histamine a while ago. We talked about kind of endocrine function of histamine. Histamine's job is important in the inflammatory response. We'll talk about that in a second. But the main thing that histamine does is it attracts more of these cells, these immune system cells, to the site of an infection. The histamine helps to do that. All right, and then this final one that's listed under the leukocytes are the natural killer cells, okay, otherwise known as the NK cells. NK cells for natural killers. The natural killer cells are interesting because they're part of both the innate and the acquired immunity response. But here under the innate immunity side, they participate in targeting cancer cells and virus-infected cells. So if a cell has been infected by a virus or is showing signs of being cancerous, that is, uncontrolled cell division, these natural killer cells do wander around and target these cells. But it's still very non-specific because it doesn't matter what virus is in there, the cells will be targeted by these natural killer cells. Okay? So these are the leukocytes, and then we have two other cell types here. The first one is the dendritic cells, called that because they have this appearance like they have lots of dendrites, but they're not nervous system cells. And these really work a lot like macrophages. They're phagocytic. They're capable of taking in things through phagocytosis. And then the last cell type here is what's called a mast cell. The mast cells are important in secretion of histamine. And because of that, they're also involved in the inflammatory response. Okay? So let's put some of these together, not all of them, but some of them together in what we'll call the inflammatory response. I keep changing the focus. So one thing I've had trouble with is the paint on the wall doesn't allow for a very good focus because it's a rough finish. All right, so here we are. There's the circulatory system. There's the integument, the skin barrier, and there's the outside world. Somebody's been poked with looks like a little piece of wood, so we're talking about a splinter. And the splinter has on it all of these bacteria. So when the splinter penetrates that anatomical barrier, we're really introducing bacteria that was on the wood into the body. Okay? So, hanging out in this part of the body are some mast cells, some macrophages, and then in the circulatory system running through, we have some neutrophils that they're showing moving through, right, the circulatory system. Okay? All right, now, when this twig came in, it looks like it damaged cells, right? It poked through a bunch of cells, and the contents of those cells then spilled out into that extracellular fluid. The extracellular fluid now contains some molecules that normally would never be seen by other cells because they're trapped inside cells. With the damage, that cytosol comes out into the extracellular fluid, and one of the cells that picks that up here are the mast cells. Okay? The mast cells pick up the presence of molecules that shouldn't be there. Normally they're hidden from them, but now they see them because of cellular damage. In response, they begin to secrete histamine. Okay? The histamine that's being secreted is part of what we call the inflammatory response, because this histamine now is being picked up by the circulatory system cells, these endothelial cells, and the histamine triggers dilation of these blood vessels that are close to the injury. The dilation of the blood vessels is assisted by nitric oxide, which can also be produced by these cells in response to histamine, and that further dilates these circulatory system vessels. Okay? The dilation, look what's happening to the endothelial cells here of the circulatory system. They're being pulled apart from each other. We get these little gaps. Those gaps. The gaps allow the fluid from the circulatory system to leave and move into the area, and the presence of that histamine allows these neutrophils to find the source of the histamine production. So the neutrophils are leaving the circulatory system and moving to the site of infection because ultimately of that histamine production. Okay? Right? Now, the neutrophils are phagocytic. They're not targeting any cells specifically. They're going after anything that's bacterial, right? If it has a wall, it's going to target it. Okay, so we have this neutrophil response to the mast cell response. And these neutrophils that are now in this area begin to phagocytize these bacterial cells. Okay, as they phagocytize them, they fuse them with the lysosome and chop them up into little pieces. And then we'll talk about the fate of those little pieces here in a second when we talk about the other immune system. But for right now, they're getting rid of the bacteria by hydrolyzing all of the biological molecules. They're breaking that bacterial cell down into its component monomers. Okay? The macrophage that we had here is also doing the same thing. Macrophages are also phagocytic, so they're wandering around, gobbling up bacteria and fusing them with a lysosome, breaking them down to their component monomers. Okay? Okay? Right? That's basically